at the very highest level, we are facing a moment where business leaders are going to have to make some tough choices, whether they are going to take advantage of this moment in the short term. So deregulation, the tax breaks, currying favor, staying quiet in the face of undermining of democratic institutions that we're seeing, or to proceed with a commitment to sustainability in the long term.
Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights and Business, also known as IHRB. I am Deborah Sago, and in this podcast, you'll hear from people working to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. You just heard from Michael Clements, the new CEO of the Business and Human Rights Center. Michael joins Brandee Butler, IHRB CEO, for a wide-ranging and insightful conversation about the shifting global landscape for business and human rights, leadership in times of uncertainty, and where hope and progress can still be found in these challenging times. Let's hear the conversation now.
Hi, I'm Brandee Butler, CEO of the Institute for Human Rights and Business, and today I'm joined by a very special guest.
Thanks so much, Brandee. I'm Michael Clements. I'm the Executive Director of the Business and Human Rights Center.
Michael, welcome. So excited to have you here today. We have a lot to talk about given the state of the world at the moment. But first, I'd be remiss if I didn't congratulate you on your new role as Executive Director of the Business and Human Rights Center. What motivated you to take this role on, and what kind of leadership are you hoping to bring to the Resource Center?
Oh, thanks, Brandee. And I have to say congratulations right back to you. This feels like a really exciting moment for both of us. And so looking forward to collaborating. I think for me, probably two big motivators in thinking about this role, and I'm very interested in the same question for you, to be honest. But in the first instance, I suppose best summed up by saying it was this organization's mission at this particular moment. You'll know that the center is dedicated to centering human rights at the heart of business, which is probably familiar to you, in order to help deliver a just economy, climate justice, and of course, to end corporate abuse. And I've always thought that this mission, this kind of reason for organizational being, really reflects the reality of our world, which is that markets and business aren't inherently moral and can be core drivers of injustice and inequality. But equally, because of how powerful and how influential the corporate sector is, there is real opportunity if we can shape and demand better practice from business for a better and more just and equitable world. So the center, with its partners and allies, I believe, really plays an important role in that effort. And certainly the IHRB is part of that. So that for me was the main driver. And of course, the second was the people. This is a group of 80 working across nearly 30 countries, really committed to the movement, but more importantly, I think, to rights holders, to communities, to workers who need a bigger say in shaping how business operates in their environments. And so the opportunity to lead an organization full of so many inspiring and committed leaders themselves really feels like an extraordinary privilege.
I can completely relate to those motivations. And you and I, we've talked about this, but we're in very similar positions, both new leaders of business and human rights organizations following long-serving leaders who made their marks in the field. And so I'm curious, in a moment of such political upheaval, such uncertainty, how are you thinking about balancing continuity with evolution in the Resource Center's work?
Yeah, I think this is such a great question for both of us. So I'm warning you, I'm going to ask it back to you in just a moment. But I was thinking, it's also a good question for our movement, which I think is really grappling with, how do we hold on to and capitalize on the gains of the last 20 years while reckoning with the fact that we do appear to be, as you're saying, in this really new moment that likely requires new strategies and new tactics and new messaging as we build, as I think we have to, more diverse support for the idea that human rights-centered business is good business and actually has to become the status quo, not just a kind of nice to have when profit margins are fat. But to your question, I think for me and for the center, I think our vision is very much about building on who we are now. So a trusted research and information platform, and I hope a partner and ally to many to evolve to meet the demands of this moment. And I think that means thinking really creatively about how do we make what I believe is our very powerful evidence base really matter in the thinking and the decision making of those in boardrooms, but also in policymaking circles and so forth. And that's about making sure that we are as equipped as we can be to respond agilely to what I think are really fast moving challenges that are shaping business and human rights, and the opportunities that we have in turn to do that shaping ourselves, guided by rights holders in the first instance, who are so often at the front line of poor corporate practice. But how are you thinking about this and that kind of balance between continuity and evolution?
My intention is to honor IHRB's rich legacy and to build on its strengths around forecasting, research, developing practical guidance and tools for businesses, and our convening power, but not to be limited by the way that things have been done in the past. As you said, the landscape is changing both fast and fundamentally. And so we need to evolve as a movement and as an organization in the ways that we support business practitioners and the wider fields to help companies better understand what's coming, why it matters, and how the decisions they make today will shape the risks and opportunities of tomorrow. And that means for us combining foresight, root cause analysis, and imagination. It also means expanding the range of expertise that we're engaging by inviting in unexpected, underrepresented, and sometimes critical voices, and particularly those who are closest to the impacts that we're all trying to address. So I think those are going to be the key elements that enable us to equip business leaders with insights and with the practical guidance that they need to act earlier and to act more responsibly.
I love that point about inviting critical voices into this space to ensure, I think, that we're not preaching to the choir, which I think is something that the movement has perhaps struggled with a little bit in the past. And thinking about how do we broaden our church? How can we make this movement more diverse to ensure that we're able to make change? So that makes, a huge amount of sense to me.
Michael, 2026 has started. It is already quite eventful. Like us at IHRB, I'm sure you and your team are deeply concerned about many troubling global events, from conflicts and humanitarian crises to ESG backlash to worsening climate driven catastrophes. The list is growing. IHRB recently published its top 10 list of business and human rights issues for 2026, including issues like corporate hushing, AI discrimination and exploitation, and the risks inherent in the rapid expansion of the defense sector. And so I'm curious about your predictions for some of the top concerns for business and human rights in 2026.
Well, let me start by saying that, as always, I thought that the IHRB's list was spot on and a really nuanced roadmap, I think, of where we are at the moment. Broadly speaking, just to your point, I think so many of us feel that the floor is really shifting beneath our feet. And we've seen the emergence, as you've said, of these radically new conditions in a relatively short period. And that's for business and investors as much as it is for states and for rights holders and for civil society. But what I'm really thinking about now is the fact that the fundamentals haven't changed. We still have to pursue a transition to green economies. We still have to rebuild public trust that seems to have cratered due to rising inequality. We still have to ensure that this extraordinary tech revolution that's upon us is delivering emancipation and not abuse and enslavement. And all of this, I think, depends on a legal and normative framework that really demands that business is centering human rights in its operations and ensures that there's a level playing field so that business that's doing that is rewarded and incentives for business to build abuse into their operating models is eliminated. So I'm thinking about this year, I suppose, with that framing in mind. And again, I think, lots of overlaps with what the IHRB list sets out, but maybe just a few specifics from my side. I think at the very highest level, we are facing a moment where business leaders are going to have to make some tough choices, and some of those will need to be public choices. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about this in the coming moments, but really reckoning with whether they are going to take advantage of this moment in the short term. So deregulation, the tax breaks, currying favor, staying quiet in the face of undermining of democratic institutions that we're seeing, or to proceed with a commitment to sustainability in the long term and to demonstrate, I think, a recognition that with these rights and privileges comes responsibilities, even in a moment where some states are saying, you know what, don't worry about those responsibilities. And I think, it will sound unappetizing to some, but the reality is we need markets to work for everybody. And that definitely includes business, but not at the expense of the rights of the most marginalized. And that requires responsible business conduct. It requires truly fair negotiations with rights holders and a commitment to sharing the prosperity of this moment. So that's for me one big area for the landscape. What are we going to see from business leaders in this moment and what's required? I think the second thing is the energy transition. The reality is we've seen enormous progress in this space. Is it enough? No. Do we need more? Yes. But the reality is we have seen real achievement here. And the economics of energy all point in only one direction over the long term. And that's something I think that we as a movement have to take and run with. But we are facing profoundly powerful forces in the fossil fuel industry and the states that act with them that are seeking to undermine the idea of a swift transition, or in some cases, a transition at all. And I think there's only one answer to that. There's only one solution, and that has to be a just energy transition, where we're able to build and retain this public trust and commitment and backing of clean energy, because communities and workers, indigenous peoples, they are all experiencing the benefit of that shift, which is not limited to energy access. That has to be done, that has to be improved, but there's more here. And I know that IHRB is doing really important work on this, but I think that corporates that are designing operations in a way that passes all the risk of this transition down to those rights holders, down to those communities, are really acting against their own self-interest, because we are seeing real rising resistance to this model, and that comes with real costs. I will just say on the other side of the spectrum, we're also starting to see the emergence, I think, of really important examples, particularly in the renewable energy space, of businesses embracing this idea of benefit sharing and new business models in that respect. So I think certainly something to watch. The last big piece for me is on tech. And I think there we have an enormous challenge. And this is something, again, that the list also reflects. But the center's research and evidence on the human rights impacts of AI and other new technologies, and that really concentrated power in a few major tech giants, I think is showing us every day that we need smart regulation of the sector and regulatory incentives for tech companies that are operating from a human rights centered place. We don't have a lot of examples of those. We know, of course, that the tech sector is grounded in this idea of, the kind of Silicon Valley principle of move fast and break things, fast innovation at any cost. But as a society, and certainly as a movement, it should cause us enormous concern that, the thing that stands to be broken here is our rights, our safety, our privacy. So for 2026, certainly for the center, a priority is action on encouraging effective, implementable rules to navigate these challenges, and using the important models that we're starting to see emerging in places like Brazil and Japan, where there's a recognition that tech regulation isn't a block on innovation. Can just be a demand that innovation doesn't come at the expense of rights. So much more to talk about, but how are you seeing the landscape? I mean, there's 10 big points for me in the IHRB list. How are you thinking about this year?
Yeah, I mean, I actually want to go back to a point that you made, and I'm really glad you brought up the benefit sharing.
Mm.
I don't know how you're feeling, but in a moment where there's so much disarray and chaos and despair, it's really easy to, I think, lose hope, right? And I think it's very important that we point to and build on signs of progress and of hope, and remember that progress is never linear. And in fact, there are hard-fought advances in human rights. And whenever there's often a cycle of backlash and regression, and we're living in that moment. But examples of benefit sharing, particularly of just transitions, are places that I look to for hope and inspiration. And as you mentioned, we're seeing, business models that really change this notion of a zero-sum game, right? So we know solar is now the cheapest form of energy, of new power. Green economies are scaling. There's growing pressure on companies linked to serious abuses, including consumer backlash, divestment, and litigation. And we're seeing it show up in practice, from IHRB is soon going to release a report that has some very compelling examples of places where there is benefit sharing and where just transitions are happening, from solar powered salt farming in India that cuts costs and raises incomes, to regenerative agroforestry in Brazil that's restoring land while creating new markets and revenue streams. These are great examples of business models that are transformative and that prove, to your point, that sustainability can create value and not just manage risk. So, amidst all of the issues that I think that you've touched on and that our top 10 issues makes clear about the operating environment getting tougher, those are places that I look for glimmers of hope. But I couldn't agree more. I mean, companies are really navigating a tough environment: geopolitical fragmentation, growing scrutiny of AI and digital systems, pressure on climate and sustainability commitments, rising expectations around the globe around responsible exits and supply chains. But I think fundamentally, what I'm taking from all of this is that businesses that understand the human rights dimensions of these shifts and follow frameworks that have been well established and tested, like the UN guiding principles, of course, those are the companies that are going to be better positioned to manage risks, right? And to operate with greater resilience and stability in an increasingly volatile world. So I think our analysis is deeply aligned, and I appreciate having places, examples to look to for hope and inspiration, because we're in this fight for the long haul and we mustn't lose sight of where progress is being gained. So thank you. Speaking of progress and fights, the European Commission's omnibus on mandatory human rights legislation dominated sustainability debates last year. Did we get too lost in this debate? I'm curious about your view on the regulatory landscape, this fight, and what these changes really signal.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, again, for us and for the movement more broadly. I think it is right to say that this legislation, the Corporate Due Diligence Directive, and associated pieces of regulation have dominated many of these debates for a few years now. But that's because of the level of ambition that they represented, really groundbreaking pieces of legislation to drive innovation and directs business to deliver sustainability and rights. It's also the case that there are lessons from that process, because we know that what was finally approved in December fell far short of what was originally envisioned and actually agreed on in terms of the scope of companies covered, the stakeholder engagement provisions, transition plans, the way that many of us thought about the opportunity of civil liability. But while I think it's right to say that we lost some battles, we have to remember that we haven't lost this war. And I think just to go back to your point about this being a very long-term effort, it's a really important point to keep in mind. In the EU context, we did secure the legal duty for large companies to respect human and environmental rights through their global value chains. That's a significant step forward. The risk-based approach of the original CSDDD was largely retained, and those harmed by due diligence failure should be able to obtain remedy before national courts, at least of member states. Again, it's not the civil liability provision that we had envisioned, but this is not nothing. And I think we would do a great disservice to this effort if we were to sort of toss it all in, because it doesn't look exactly like we had hoped. Equally importantly, we are seeing such powerful momentum for the idea of mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence really taking root in other jurisdictions around the world, in Japan, in South Korea, in Thailand, Indonesia, Colombia, Brazil, I think Mexico, Canada. The African Commission, we know, is leading an effort to develop a regional framework on business and human rights. So these are enormously important opportunities for us to capitalize on and to support and to give generously of knowledge within the movement, the lessons learned from the EU process, as these other due diligence initiatives are gaining traction around the world, because what an opportunity in 2026.
Yeah, I agree. I think the omnibus ultimately became a proxy for a bigger political shift. And we learned a lot about the European Commission's appetite to withstand pressure and its appetite to lead on governing corporate power when the politics have gotten a lot tougher. But I agree with you. It's I think we should mourn our losses, but reflect and learn from them, but also celebrate and fight for the implementations of the wins, which are not insignificant. And the battle is now shifting away from Brussels into member states. So now the fight ahead is really going to be about strengthening access, among other things, but strengthening access to justice through transposition, procedural law, strategic litigation, and monitoring by civil society that must continue. So I think that's the conversation going forward. But I agree, the successes are still there and they are significant.
Just to your point, and as that is the sort of the battleground shifts in Europe, and maybe this is applicable more broadly. If there's a moment in our reflection for us to consider what it looks like to build popular support for these initiatives, and I think to the point around making sure that we're building a movement that is accessible and that people who wouldn't traditionally identify as business and human rights advocates feel is a movement worth joining because their own interests can be represented. What can we learn from that process? Was it too insular? I don't know, but I think these are really important questions if we're looking to make this matter in the future, which I think we have to your point.
Yeah, that's a great point. Speaking of looking beyond the BHR bubble that we exist in, and also what can we learn from clearly the very effective advocacy tactics, those who were opposed to legislation. So I think there's lots to learn there. Michael, to close us out, as I've taken up this role, I've heard many people calling for a different type of leadership in business and human rights and in business right now. And so I'd love to hear for business leaders who are listening, what kind of leadership you think this particular moment requires.
I think, and this goes to a lot of what we've spoken about already, but in this moment of such polarization, I think we certainly see that companies are feeling or may feel compelled to be less visible and less vocal and less action oriented in terms of their support for business and human rights. And there's reasons for that, and we all know what they are. But this is equally a moment that does demand business leadership and a longer term view than this quarter's or this next quarter's profits. I think we would always say that as business and human rights advocates, but where like institutions being systematically undermined quarter by quarter, where we being told that the rule of law just doesn't matter anymore. And all of the uncertainty that comes with that kind of chaos, there's no real argument that that can be good for business in the long term. We know that this turmoil will actually mean increased risks and higher costs and more fragmentation for the private sector over time. And so whether individually or collectively through industry associations or multi-stakeholder initiatives, this does feel like a moment for business leaders to defend the institutions and defend the initiatives that support responsible business conduct and that have for many years. I think that would be the first piece. And the second is to act as stewards of making markets work for everyone. To think about, to your earlier point, what do new business models look like where others are sharing in prosperity? It's a tough one because historically that's been an argument that has fallen, at least for the center, on deaf ears with the private sector. But to your point, and certainly our research is showing that there is a new opening to this because there is a recognition that communities, that workers, that rights holders need more, where business is able to gain so much from operating in these communities and in capitalizing on these global supply chains. So I would say a longer term outlook by business and an openness to thinking about what does shared prosperity look like in 2026 and beyond. And of course, the kind of primary holders of that information are those rights holders that are directly affected by business action around the world. So listening, I think, is the other big piece. What about you? What do you think?
I was actually going to say one of the reasons I'm so excited about your leadership is that I really have the sense that in a moment when debates and conversations can easily become quite abstract and quite technical, I think that you and I are both committed to leadership that centers real world impacts on people and on nature. And I think this is a moment that requires collaboration and collective thinking and action. And I think you and I are going to work well together in that same spirit. And so I'm so excited for your leadership and the opportunity to support one another. And I want to thank you for sharing with us your insights, your ideas, and your time. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. This is the first of many, I'm sure.
Oh, Brandee, me too. And thank you so much for the opportunity. But I'm more excited about our future opportunities for collaboration.
It's so important to recognize that progress is still being made, sometimes in ways that don't always make the headlines. Thank you, Brandee and Michael, for this very important conversation. And thank you for listening to this episode of Voices, which is brought to you from the Institute for Human Rights and Business. Until next time, be sure to share and follow this podcast, that way you will never miss an episode. And if you'd like to find out more about the work that we do at IHRB, then head to ihrb.org.